Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's MDICx webinar. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I'm the Program Director at MDIC for our Science of Patient Input initiative, and it's my pleasure to host this webinar on tools for advancing patient-centered medical device clinical trials. I'm delighted to have two members of MDIC's Science of Patient Input Steering Committee here today to share a little bit about the work that our working group has been working on over the past year to really understand the tools for working with patients on the design of clinical trials. I'll have each of my panelists introduce themselves briefly, but I want to mention before we get started that I hope you all have questions for our panelists, and you can submit those questions via the chat box or via the Q&A box, which is in the toolbar on the top of your screen. And we'll get to questions hopefully the last 15 minutes of today's hour. So Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Stephanie. Just checking you can hear me.
Yes, sound good.
Right. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. My name is Matthew McCarty. I am the head of patient engagement at ICON Clinical Research, a global clinical research organization. And prior to that, I spent 10 years as another large CRO. And my team's responsibility at ICON is really for supporting patients and their study partners and family to take part in medical device and diagnostic research by removing the barriers of participation and simplifying study activities. And I'm really passionate about patient inclusion and collaboration in the design of studies and how we can reduce the burden of participation in studies, particularly around the use of remote and direct-to-patient methodologies. And I've been part of this working group for the last 18 months with colleagues from industry, regulators, patient advocacy groups, and really excited to share with you today some of the work we've been doing.
Terrific. Thanks, Matt. And Mike?
And I'm Mike Otleski from Med Institute, which is a full-service CRO who managing and consulting on all aspects of clinical trials, but also providing regulatory services and engineering, bench testing and design as well. And personally, I've been designing and managing clinical trials for about 12 years in a variety of therapeutic areas, and mostly devices, but some biologics and cell therapies as well. And like Matt, I've gotten involved for about the past 18 months with the MDIC group because I care a lot about getting patients involved as much as we can in the research process.
Terrific. Thanks, Mike. So Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Apologies for that, everybody. I seem to have got myself muted, but I think I'm back now. So before we get into sharing some of the data that we've been collecting and some of our early conclusions and plans for the future, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we've even done these activities. What are some of the challenges of medical device and diagnostic clinical trials, and why have we set up a working group, and what are we doing? So data from across both drug and device studies, this is generally well known across the industry, about protocol amends. So 60% of studies require at least one protocol amend. The average is actually 2 to 3, some many more. And of those protocol amends, 20% of those protocol amends in the particular research that was done here by Tufts was due to protocol design flaws and difficulties recruiting study volunteers. And in that context, 34% of the sponsors involved in those studies actually said that those protocol amends were either partially or completely avoidable if there'd been different thinking or planning or understanding upfront, particularly around patients and their needs and the applicability for their particular trial. And this research showed that the average cost for a protocol amend is a little bit under $500,000. That actually excludes a number of elements, and so the costs on a large study can rise significantly beyond that. So you've got time delays, you've got significant costs, you've got problems, and you've got lack of ability for patients to join studies. Not new to any of us, but sets a bit of the background. Then we come to actually recruiting patients. 11% of sites fail to enroll a single patient, 37% of sites under-enroll, Over $1 billion is spent on patient recruitment activities specifically every year. And to initiate a single site, depending whose estimate you believe, is somewhere between about $25,000 or $50,000. So obviously, if a lot of those are under-enrolling or even failing to enroll a patient, again, we've got delays and costs. Some research there from both Discourage and from Tufts. And we also have retention challenges. So even for those patients that do manage to enroll successfully in a study, on average, more than 30% of clinical trial participants drop out before becoming evaluable. That's taken from large pivotal studies, phase 3 drug studies. As you move into long-term follow-up studies and observational and real-world studies, that can go up, and you could be looking at 40, 50% dropout or loss to follow-up on some of those long-term follow-up studies. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. And even if you have a patient who's technically still contactable and in the study and hasn't dropped out, what's the protocol compliance like? Were all visits attended? Was their ePro completed? We're using a lot more wearables and sensors to collect data. Was that worn properly? Was it transmitting all the right data? Did they complete any follow-up calls that might be needed annually, etc.? So there's a lot of different factors to get us to the point where we can actually have the valuable data we need to have regulators make the right decisions about products coming to market to help patients. Nothing new there. I also want to talk a little bit about health literacy. Health literacy is defined as the ability to find, understand, and use basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. And in 2003, the National Assessment of Adult Literacy performed a study in the US that showed that only 12% of US adults had proficient health literacy. Only 12%. I think those numbers have improved a little bit, but are still relatively low. And over a third of US adults, that's about 77 million people, would have difficulty with common health tasks, such as following directions on a prescription drug label or adhering to a childhood immunization schedule using a standard chart. So the way we talk about studies, some of the language we use in industry, some of the jargon that goes into protocols and even ICF forms, we need to do some work on. Also, studies are becoming more complex, and actually in our attempt to simplify studies for patients and improve access to studies for patients, we're potentially actually increasing patient burden. If you assume that most clinical research today still happens at a site, there is an increasing focus on remote data collection and even virtual studies, but the majority of studies, particularly in the device space, still works around a research site. This is already an additional burden to a patient's normal life. They have to travel to the site somehow, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's local and fairly easy, or maybe it's a specialist center that requires traveling across multiple states. The site's probably going to give some printed information, maybe some text message, visit reminders, or some other information. This is an additional burden to what's already filling a patient's life. What a patient cares about is their family, their health, getting the kids to school, taking the dog for the walk, doing the grocery shopping, maybe dealing with the challenges that come along with their particular disease if it's a more debilitating disease area. And clinical research is obviously not top of mind to a patient, and adding in mandated protocol visits and other activities is an additional burden on their life. And what we've done as an industry, and I've been part of this over the last decade or so, is think about all the different ways we can work directly with patients. So maybe we'll collect data directly from them on a device in their home or through their own smartphone. And we'll have an ePro vendor provide text messages and reminders to do their ePro. Maybe we'll compensate a patient for that. Maybe we'll pay a patient $30 for each ePro they do in recognition of their time. We'll have a compensation vendor send them gift cards or let them know that we've refunded money into their bank account or collect expenses of visiting a site. There used to be a lot of study web portals where a vendor would set up a web portal with information about the study, send motivational messages and what's coming up at the next visit. These days, that's more likely to be an app of some sort, but are probably completely unconnected from the ePro platform and the compensation vendor. And this list goes on. You know, we might have had study support and follow-up on the telephone. We may add wearables and sensors to collect data or to use in the home. We've probably got some technical support if we're doing all of this. We may even be shipping other elements to your home, whether that be the wearables and sensors or other factors. And we've created an environment that can become quite complex for a patient who doesn't live the day-to-day clinical trial journey to be part of a study. And so we're thinking about how we can do this a little bit better and genuinely make a study easier for a patient to be involved and more meaningful for a patient and the data we're collecting. So some of that data came from the drug world. There's some mixed data from both drug and device, but we don't have a huge amount of dedicated device industry data on some of that. But anecdotally, talking with our industry members at MDIC and other industry stakeholders, this experience resonates with patients, with industry, etc. But we want to look and say, well, what's been done in the medical device industry? What's been done for devices and for diagnostics to really help with reducing that patient burden and designing studies that patients can actually participate in? And why is that different? Maybe can we just copy some of the work that's been done in the drug industry? Well, looking at some of the registrations for this call, I don't need to educate you on the device industry and the difference between a class 1 device or a class 3 device or an IVD. But maybe let's just take a couple of examples and some of the things we've thought about as a working group at MDIC about why device studies might be different and why we maybe need some additional guidance or support or information, particularly for our industry and for device studies. So let's take a surgical implant as an example. A much greater level of invasion than maybe taking a drug. Obviously a different thinking process for a patient to go through in terms of do they want to be involved to start with? What are the risks involved? What procedures do they have to undergo? Possibly a smaller study population we're recruiting. So each patient is really key to get right and make sure that they're retained in the study and supported. Limited options to stop treatment. With a number of drugs, you can just decide to opt out and stop. A little bit more difficult in a surgical implant setting. And so different commitment level of the patients to the study. Something that's much less common in the drug world, the skill of the surgeon or the investigator that can impact the outcome. You're not just making a decision about the study and the device, but also the particular surgeon implanting that device. And the whole level of understanding that a patient needs to have before making a decision to be involved in such a study. And long-term follow-up required, potentially different impacts on a surgical implant. Take breast implants, for example, that may have a 10-year follow-up period. And 10-year follow-up is a long time for anybody. Maybe you've changed jobs, changed contact details, changed telephone numbers, moved house, moved addresses, changed states, changed countries, changed motivations for being involved in a trial, changed health status. And trying to maintain that long-term follow-up over such a long period can be a challenge for any study, but can be a required element of some surgical implant studies. At the other extreme, we might have something like an in vitro diagnostic. Might seem like an easier study on the outset than the surgical implant study we just talked about. But in this context, we're looking for a healthy study population. So actually not really a patient at all in a lot of cases, but much more a healthy study population who may not feel like they have a need to be involved in a study. Probably a much larger study population, so much greater need to recruit patients and increase that population. May require undesirable tests, so might require a colonoscopy or some other type of invasive procedure as a comparison. And why would a healthy study participant want to undergo something like a colonoscopy when there's no direct benefit to them? And again, when we talk about dropout, once you've given your sample, maybe it's a blood collection study, maybe you've given your blood sample, kind of hard to drop out at that point, kind of what's done is done. So again, options limited. So just two examples. Obviously, there's all sorts of different types of devices and diagnostics, but a couple of examples just to give you some of the insight into what we discussed as a team as part of our research as to why we think there are differences in device studies, and therefore why maybe we need to do some specific research within our industry and some specific guidance that we're going to talk about to help our device industry better involve patients in the design of trials. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mike, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing.
Thank you, Matt. So as Matt's been discussing, we were interested in maximizing patient participation in clinical trials and thinking through the various ways to tackle that problem, because it's an industry-wide, as Matt explained. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just waiting to get control of the slides here. And one of the ways we chose to try to tackle that or approach that problem is thinking about how can we make it easier for industry stakeholders or sponsors to engage patients in the trial design process up front. So not waiting until the trial is running and trying to recruit and tackle those enrollment issues and retention issues. But if we can get patients involved up front designing studies, what sort of benefits would we find? The idea being, if we can get sponsors to survey patients or somehow obtain their input on their preferences or barriers to joining studies, then the sponsors can design trials that really reflect the patient's priorities for that particular patient population, whatever their diagnosis, disease, or prognosis. And then ultimately, the trials that would be run would have better patient involvement, better patient participation, better patient compliance, which would lead to better data, potentially getting these treatments out there for widespread use faster. And then to begin with, as Matt mentioned, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So first we looked into what other groups were doing in this space and the kind of research as far as patient engagement and obtaining patient input and patient preferences. And a lot of groups are doing some really great work in creating these tools to help companies do that. But a lot of it was focused on the drug space. And so we looked into differences with device and in vitro diagnostics and how those may affect these particular challenges. And that's why we decided to go ahead with our own research that's sort of focused on our specific area. One of the early efforts we made was creating a survey for patients. And we reached out to some patient advocacy groups and others with a web-based survey to try to just figure out, for one, what has their participation in clinical research been like? Have they been made aware of opportunities? Have they been approached, or have they sought out opportunities to participate in research? And then if they had or had not, why or why not? And what sort of characteristics of a clinical trial would encourage a patient to participate or discourage them? And then finally, to get patients involved earlier in the research process, like designing the studies, what sort of appetite is there? Do patients want to be involved at that level? And how would they like to be involved at that level? So firstly, we ended up with 124 respondents over a couple month period. And we asked, 30 some odd questions. It was kind of a branching structure. So, if they answered yes to one, then they would get a different set of follow-up questions. Or if they had not participated, they would see a different set of questions. And so here are a few of the highlights that kind of, speak to the main results we found. But the full survey results can be found on the MDIC website, which I think Stephanie will mention later on. So to begin with, how did patients hear about clinical trials? And for the most part, it was from a doctor or healthcare professional, probably an investigator in the study, and in some cases through a clinical trial website. I think the more proactive patients who know to look on clinicaltrials.gov or something like that can find them. But for the most part, I think they need to be approached. And then asking what characteristics would encourage a patient to participate in a trial. And I think we all think we know, but how better than to get it from the horse's mouth and see what they actually care about, what their priorities are, and what would encourage them to participate in a study. And it looks like, for the most part, personal benefits, but the largest response we got was for that altruistic motive of potential benefits to others. And then to a much lesser extent, compensation for their involvement, or the fact that the study would not require any extra burden from them as far as visits and things like that, which is a little lower than I expected. And then the flip side of that coin, what characteristics of a clinical study might discourage patients from participating? And so this particular question was, if they were invited to participate in a study and chose not to, why not? What kept them from doing that? And for the most part, it was, they were concerned about the risks of procedures, risks of an experimental treatment, less so the risk of privacy concerns, somewhat worried about too many visits or the burden of extra effort that would be required. I do appreciate that patients would mention that up front and choose not to participate, knowing those burdens, rather than those who decide to participate and then drop out later on because they find out it's too onerous, or they were maybe a little more aspirational in the beginning. And then one of the other main points was thinking about getting patients involved earlier in the process. Would they want to give input into a trial design and talk about endpoints that matter to them, or maybe what threshold of improvement would count as significant to the patient versus what we might consider statistically significant or clinically relevant. And it turns out, I think the overall takeaway is there's very much an interest in doing that. And so we asked different ways they'd be willing to be involved, to give their input, to give their opinions on trial designs. And it turns out in many ways, in most ways, they'd be willing to share their own experiences with other patients or on websites. They'd be willing to talk to the industry stakeholders. They'd be willing to talk to regulators. And other patients. Something else, on a different but related question that kind of surprised me. We were looking for opportunities and things that we might do better. And one characteristic they were interested in was receiving study results after the fact. They said they never get followed up to figure out what actually happened with the trial after they were done participating. And that's something that would encourage them to participate, that then they could also share with fellow patients. And I think that's something, it's kind of an example of low-hanging fruit. It seems like it would be easy for sponsors to circle back, provide those to the study sites, to be able to provide those on to the patient, some kind of summary of results. And so that's the kind of thing that we could do fairly easily, it seems, to make a difference as far as encouraging patients to participate. After that, after the patient survey, we also implemented a stakeholder survey of industry, sponsors and manufacturers and things, to see, first of all, what their attitude is toward collecting patient input. Is that a practice that they regularly implement? If not, why not? Or if so, in what manner do they typically do it? But then we also wanted to find out what does the industry side think motivates patients, to be able to compare that with what patients say motivates themselves. So we first asked, how often do trial sponsors seek that sort of input from patients into the trial design before the trial starts, before their protocol has been finalized, to help determine the endpoints that they're going to be looking at, or determine their thresholds of significance or success? And it turns out not very often. Mostly less than 25% of the time, or never, do they seek this sort of patient input. And then some companies who do, it seems like they have a process in place where that's done most of the time, or often, or every time, in sort of a formalized process rather than ad hoc. And then for companies who may, or particular scientists designing trials who may wish to get that sort of feedback from patients, we asked, what barriers do they face? What challenges would keep them from doing so if they had wanted to? We find, for the most part, it's privacy concerns, confidentiality of the patients, which I think ties to logistical issues like finding the patients and getting access to them. I think for those of us in the sponsors, we typically don't have direct access to patients. And we're taught, from day one, patient privacy is the utmost concern. And well, secondly, safety is the utmost concern. But aside from that, privacy. And so we're kind of hesitant to think about how to reach out to patients directly and get to know them. So I think there's an opportunity there as far as connecting patient groups with the project sponsors. And then others just weren't sure how to proceed, even if they knew where patients were and where to find them and how to contact them, how to efficiently and constructively gain that feedback to be used, and how to incorporate that into their trial design. So then on the flip side, for sponsors who do collect that sort of feedback, the question is, how do they typically do that? And some talk with patient group representatives, mostly through surveys or patient interviews. Other sources of input that they mentioned were having information relayed from the patients through the prospective study sites, through the investigators. Others said they had patients on their program steering committees who could provide that kind of perspective. And then, do stakeholders understand what motivates patients? So this was what we as the industry think motivates patients, to be able to compare with what patients say motivates patients. And for the most part, it lines up pretty well. Industry thinks that patients care mostly about personal benefit to their own health. To some extent, that altruistic motive of spreading the knowledge gained from the study. Mostly access to new treatments. I guess industry rated a little higher the burden of participating in the study, and they thought that would prevent patients more than patients admitted that it would. So I think there's an opportunity there.
Mike, one of the things I think that surprised me personally when we looked at the physician or the industry responses versus the patient was one of the important elements was the industry thought was the doctor recommending the study. So I think it was heading for 90% of the industry representatives thinking that a doctor recommending the study was really important. And yet when we looked at the patient response to that, it was less than 50%. And similarly with treatments not working, over 80% of the industry respondents thought that a key factor of patients choosing to enroll would be other treatments not working. And actually for patients, that was less than 50%. And I know our sample size was only a little bit over 100 in both cases. But I think just some of those disconnects there, without overly reading into any one in particular, just highlighted to me some of the differences between what we as industry think and what an actual patient who's living with a particular disease and considering a particular trial might be important to them.
Yeah, thank you. I meant to point that out, that based on the results of the patient survey, it seemed that they relied on their doctor or healthcare provider to inform them of the study or to invite them into the study, but that they rated much more lowly, that it was the doctor convincing them to join, whereas industry thought much more highly that was the case.
And I don't know about your experience, Mike, but I was really surprised at how few organizations are gaining any real patient input into either the protocol or the study design. I guess we started this survey in this group assuming there may be a gap, but I personally was surprised at how, I'm not saying it would happen in a very structured way that would be a major industry case study, but I was surprised how few organizations had managed to do anything at all to actually gain patient input into their protocol designs and their study designs.
Yeah, in my experience, it's been, well, I think that industry tends to rely on the physicians to know the patients. And so it seems, at least from my personal experience, what I've seen, it seems like more of a getting secondhand information and trusting that physicians know what clinical outcomes are important or needed. And now we're seeing that sort of shift to direct patient access.
I think as we looked at these results, that they led to an interesting discussion among our working group of where those results were kind of disjointed and what that meant for how we put resources forward to identify patients for clinical trials. I mean, we had just talked about the fact that a large number of our industry stakeholders assumed that physician recommendation was one of the highest factors in getting patients to enroll in clinical trials, but our patients said that it was important, but perhaps not the most important factor. But, then our industry partners tend to invest most of their recruitment dollar in working with physicians to identify patients. So, kind of an interesting disconnect, and perhaps an opportunity for MDIC and others to continue to educate about what opportunities may be out there to engage with patients in a meaningful way.
And Mike shared the link earlier. All of these survey results, the patient results, the industry results, and kind of our conclusions around that are all available on the MDIC website. So feel free to go and take a look yourselves. This survey was never intended to be kind of the sample size was never intended to allow us to look at any one of these issues and feel like we knew the entire industry, but to maybe highlight some of the disconnects and start to justify and question whether that there's work to be done. And I think our initial conclusions were there are some gaps, there's some opportunities, and there's some gaps.
Yes, thank you, Matt. I'm trying to go back on slides, back on slide 33, it sounded like. We have a question on the Q&A, and I encourage all of you that are listening here, if you have questions, please put those into the Q&A or points that you'd like to make. Someone had asked here about the really high response that we got on privacy, and Matt and Mike, I'm wondering if you might be willing to kind of discuss this a little bit more on why do you think industry thinks privacy is such a high barrier, especially when we didn't really see this amongst our patients. What do you think the thought process is here?
Yeah, I can only speak from my experience, but in clinical research, from an operational perspective, it's drilled into us that sponsors don't speak with patients. We want to make sure that the collection of data is de-identified and there's no undue influence, and we've run an appropriate process to protect patient confidentiality and to reduce bias, and all of the various things we have to prove as part of clinical trials. And so by default, in my experience, sponsors think, well, we shouldn't be talking to patients. In Europe, you can't even do that in the commercial setting. You can't advertise to patients. In the US, it's a little bit different. And then you've got potential undue influence around compensating patients. Well, if I pay a patient to tell me something, am I bribing them? And so there's lots of what I would describe as fear factors about how you might go around and solicit input from a patient that, for the most part, are well-founded in terms of the ethos behind them, but I don't believe are actually relevant and necessary for what we're talking about here. And actually, it's perfectly appropriate to speak to patients who might be potential users of your product and understand their disease, understand their concerns, understand their potential challenges around getting involved in a particular protocol. And there are a few things you do need to put in place that are fairly basic that, Stephanie, I know you're going to talk about next steps, but hopefully our methodology guidance and some of our reports will help with some of these challenges. But actually, it's fairly straightforward to go ahead, and as long as you do it in the right way, get input from patients on protocols, on drug design, on study design. And I think it's a fear factor. Who wants to take a risk and end up getting a fine or getting a bad reputation or getting in trouble with the regulator? But I think maybe the barriers that have been built up in people's head are a lot larger than the actual barriers that exist in the real world, although they can turn into kind of risk-averse barriers within a particular company.
Great, thanks, Matt. I have another question that's come in on the Q&A. From previous discussions, CROs highlight the limited window of opportunity often provided by sponsors during the bidding process to allow for any meaningful patient engagement activities to take place. I'm wondering if both of you might comment on kind of how we can set expectations for when to fit this in as far as the timing of getting this patient input.
Mike, do you want to go first?
Well, it's a good question. And my experience as a CRO has been that we've gotten involved at every different stage of the process of developing a study versus the protocol is already finalized and approved by the time it comes to us, and there is no opportunity to influence it. So I think the burden is on the sponsor to solicit that sort of input, or to be open to getting that sort of input before they finalize it and put the stamp on it that the protocol is done and we're executing it.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I also think that it's probably not going to get fixed by any one party in the journey. I think everyone from sites to CROs to sponsors to patients to investigators, maybe not patients so much, would attest to kind of the rush to try and get things done. We must meet our first patient in, we must get our first site activated, we must get our protocol approved, we must finish recruitment, we must lock the database. And whether those are well-intended, let's get our product to market, or more corporate goal-driven, there are deadlines and timelines, and we'd be unrealistic if we weren't thinking people weren't working to management expectations, corporate targets, budget requirements, etc. There's a lot of money and people involved in these processes, so those things are going to exist. And so I think it's going to require more of an overall bigger picture change on behalf of the industry to realize the importance of these. If you remember where our slides started, we talked about protocol amends, the cost and delays of those for not getting the right patient input to start with. Talked about recruitment costs and delays, retention and dropout issues. And a lot of those things, as we saw with some of the research that had been done, can be mitigated with the right understanding of the patient population and the right design of the study to start with. And so I think on a individual basis, an individual study project manager or an individual site, it's difficult to add in a process for involving patients within your small piece of the puzzle. If your job is to start up a site and you've got 3 months and you take 6 weeks to gain some patient input, you've radically stretched your timelines, and you're going to be held accountable for not meeting your piece of the puzzle. But ultimately, from a sponsor perspective, if you're running a multi-year study and you can mitigate the chance of protocol amends, lack of recruitment, lack of retention, delays, you may find that taking 6 weeks to gather really good patient input and design a protocol that's going to be more meaningful, give you better data and have more patients involved, you could save months in study delays, protocol amends, etc. So I get when people say, there's no time, and I think operationally that is true, but we know there's delays and problems in research, and there's plenty of time. Taking a few weeks or slightly longer in a multi-year process is usually perfectly reasonable. It's squeezing in between projects being awarded and sites being started up that can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree, Matt. That's a great point. Too often, I think the metric that people focus on is time to first patient enrolled, when it really needs to be time to complete data set or time to regulatory approval, or what that ultimate goal is. And yeah, if you take a little bit more time up front, if people can shift that mindset to take some time to get the patient input up front, design better trials that will enroll faster with better patient compliance, end up with better data, with a data set that maybe is more likely to help a regulator make that approval, then ultimately a lot of time can be saved on the back end.
Yeah, I think it's going to take some really good case studies of sponsors being bold and saying, we took this step and it did cost us a small amount of time and money up front, but this is where it's paid off. I think it's going to take some of those examples for industry to start thinking, okay, well, there's a benefit there and this is the right thing to do.
Great, thank you. Another question on the Q&A. In real-world evidence studies, one of the issues that frequently comes up are concerns about being perceived as promoting off-label use. This has come up with patient engagement as well. What are your thoughts on how to best address this concern?
I understand where this is coming from. It is a valid point. I think done correctly, I've not seen it be too much of an issue. I mean, you need to understand the context of the study. So we talk about, real world observational environment. It's very different to an interventional pivotal study. That's the point of the question. But everything gets IRB approved. So I think if you've got people who truly understand the point of the protocol and where, creating patient content and patient education would create an undue influence or a bias, So there's an expertise needed in developing the content that's fit for purpose. And then ultimately, one would expect that the IRB would be reviewing that content with the mindset of what's this being used for, and is this going to develop any implications? I don't work for an IRB, so I'm not going to comment on that. It's valid, but I think with the right understanding and expertise for developing the content, it shouldn't be a limiting factor. I think the thing to remember, we're talking a lot about patient input during the design process. So this is a really good point around communicating with patients when they're on a study. But if you're soliciting patient input before a study started, while a protocol is being designed or the strategy is being developed, those aren't patients on your study. They aren't subjects involved in your study. So, you're not under that same IRB protocol restrictions that you would be talking to an enrolled patient. You could almost think of it as market research. The methodology is probably a little bit different to market research, but it's almost market research. You're just going out to patients that would fit that criteria to gather their input.
Great. I have a question here about protocol changes. Are changes to the protocol midway in a clinical trial, could they also be a reason for patients dropping out of the study? And if so, is there anything we can do to overcome that challenge?
Mike, you want to take that one?
In my experience, it's for the most part been the opposite. Certainly that could happen depending on what the changes are being made to the protocol, but typically throughout the course of the study, we're finding things that aren't working or certain challenges within the study sites or with the patient flow as far as recruitment and follow-up. And so typically the amendments have been to fix those or to try to ease them as much as we can, while maintaining the scientific integrity of the study and the data that are already collected. So typically it's been to help patients and hopefully improve retention throughout the course of the study.
Interesting anecdotal experience, literally from a couple of hours before this call that I had today. I was talking with a post-oncology trial patient. Long story short, she'd been through everything that her physician recommended at a real quality Northeastern institute, and had been basically given the news that there was nothing else that could be done. Cancer metastasized, it was inoperable, and that was it. And through a series of events that I won't go into, she found a clinical trial, an investigator-initiated clinical trial, and that drug saved her life. And she's now 3, 4, 5 years, no evidence of disease, and is now a huge advocate for clinical trials. And interesting, one of her experiences talking to her about what was good and bad about the clinical trial, and obviously her overwhelming, whatever the operational challenges were, her overwhelming reaction is, it saved my life, so I don't care. But one of the things she said was around protocol amends. That wasn't the language she used, but it was pretty obvious that was what happened. Was a patient signing a consent form can be a scary thing. They can be pages and pages and pages, still lots of language that patients might not understand, going back to our health literacy points earlier. And you kind of feel like you've got no choice. I've got to sign this, or I'm not going to get access to the trial, but I'm kind of signing my life away here. So it's a big deal for a patient. And every time there was a protocol amend on her study, she was given a whole new consent to sign without any clear clarification around what had changed, why she was re-signing, what was different. And that whole fear process came into her mind again. And so, I don't have the solution for this. I'm just kind of passing on her experience. But one of the things that struck me is surely we must be able to do a much better job of allaying fears, around the whole consent process for sure, but particularly around a protocol change where maybe it's a relatively small change that does require an updated signature, but from a patient's perspective might be a change that is of insignificant value to the patient. And we could make that protocol reconsenting process much less painful. I would have only even thought about that if I'd heard from a patient today. So that's not something that would have crossed my mind if we hadn't got some patient input.
Yeah. Well, we still have time for a few more questions, but while we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, I do want to talk a little bit about what's coming next for MDIC's Science of Patient Input group. So the work that Matt and Mike have talked about today is part of a larger effort that MDIC is undertaking to develop a framework for patient input in medical device clinical trials. And we envisioned this as kind of a suite of tools and reports that and made up of primarily 3 sub-projects. And the stuff we've been talking about today, the methodologies to maximize patient participation in clinical trials, really falls into that second bullet point on the screen here. In addition to that work, we're working on guidelines for integrating patient preference information into the design of clinical trials. This follows up on some work that MDIC did last year in partnership with FDA, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, RTI Health Solutions, and MIT, using patient preference information to help inform the statistical design of clinical trials. That is the p-value. So we're working on kind of a follow-up effort to that report, or to that project, really unpacking what the implications are of that to how we design clinical trials going forward, and what needs to happen to make that kind of individualized approach to clinical trials more frequent occurrence than the occasional one-off experimental approach. We'll be publishing a report later this year on these methodologies to maximize patient participation in clinical trials. And then next year, we'll be releasing a report that really summarizes the evidence for all of these methods that we've explored, and a framework for how we might approach it going forward. So as I mentioned, next year we will, later this summer, we will have a draft report on the methodologies to maximize patient participation in clinical trials. As with all the work we do at MDIC, one of the most important things that we can do is to put draft reports out to the public for comment. And I hope that all of you will be able to take a look at that information and to draw on your own experiences to provide us feedback on whether this report is useful and whether we've really hit the right points. So look for that later this summer. Also, I want to encourage you to save the date. MDIC is hosting a patient engagement forum on November 13th. This will be an in-person meeting where we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of the work that MDIC has done to advance the science of patient input. But we'll also be looking to have a larger conversation about what the work we've done within the medical device and regulatory space, how that ultimately helps inform effective shared decision-making conversations between clinicians and patients. So we're really looking forward to that discussion as well. So save the date for sure. Another question that's come in out on our Q&A, the NIHR, I'm wondering if that means NIH, is designing a national way of working to engage the life sciences with patient groups at the clinical trial stage, and said, excuse the plug, but we always appreciate a plug. But how do we help measure the impact of this as an example case study or metrics outside of delivery? So just to summarize that, how do we, I guess the question that's being asked, and I think Matt and Mike, I think we've had some discussions on this, is how do we study the impact of these patient engagement activities?
Yeah, I think it's actually a UK-based question, the NIHR UK body. Okay. Thank you for being international. I appreciate it. I think it's really difficult, and I don't know what Stephanie and Mike think, but I don't think there's a simple answer. Where our industry is so used to this kind of randomized control environment where you take two things, you strip out any variables, and you measure scientifically one versus the other to get to a result. And that's generally appropriate for developing products, medical products, although there's debate about pragmatic trials, etc. But that's the kind of data that people expect to see when they're looking at any new initiatives or innovation. So I think we're unlikely to see a scenario where half the patients on one study go on a protocol that's been designed with patient inputs and half don't, and a sponsor takes the risk of running one trial that's going to work well and one that's going to be slow and painful. And we get to see that A/B comparison to prove that this methodology is worthwhile versus another. I think that's the kind of data that people would like to see, and I don't think it's ever going to happen. So personally, I think data and metrics is tough. There's no centralized database that I'm aware of in any country that tracks, comparatively study performance and patient engagement and satisfaction and those type of elements that can sometimes be subjective, but obviously you can look at protocol amends and time delays, etc. So I don't know about metrics. I do know that a couple of sponsors have done some piloting and some innovation and have got some great case studies to say, we have seen faster than we would usually expect, or we have seen less drop-off than we would usually expect, or we've had less protocols than we would normally expect. And I think if that comes from sponsors, that they're actually doing things and they're saying, yes, this is proving beneficial for us, and then because of that, they're influencing their own organization to do more, I think that will have an impact on the industry. It's going to take some time and some more innovative sponsors. I don't know whether metrics that we can prove is going to happen easily, but I'd be very interested in anyone on the call who's got views on those to share those. We'd love to hear more about that and get other people's views.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And as Matt said, it'll be difficult to control for all the variables. Maybe you could find 2 studies of similar products with a similar disease state and similar number of patients, and see how the endpoints differ, how the follow-up differs, how the ultimate, the timeline of the studies differs if one says that they had obtained patient input and sort of tailored the study that way. Something else that occurs to me is maybe the medical device industry is uniquely suited to tackle that question with the iterative nature of some of these devices. And so you kind of have, original trials from predicate devices, and you could compare the trial from the next generation device and see. Now, of course, other advances will have been made, so it'll be hard to control for those variables. But you almost have a ready-made comparison if you have multiple generations of the same kind of device.
Finally, I do want to mention all of the resources that MDIC publishes under our Science of Patient Input initiative are available on our website. The survey results are available now on the website. Also available on the website is a literature review that we did in support of this work, which really has a number of great resources and points to a number of places where other groups are doing really great work in this space. As Mike said during his presentation, our goal as we've approached this through the MDIC is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we don't want to duplicate good work where it already exists. Where other organizations have done good work on helping medical product developers interact with and work with patients, we've highlighted that. So those resources are available on our website, and like I said, we anticipate that later this summer we will be releasing some reports for public comment, and we really value the input that you all who are working in the medical devices industry and working on clinical trials can provide us on those reports. So Matt and Mike, I'll maybe give you a chance if you have any last comments that you'd like to make.
I would just say that whilst we've had some fantastic input in our various working groups and surveys, there is no one answer to a lot of this. And so we're always interested in other perspectives, other data points, things that people disagree with or have more viewpoints on. So do get in touch. You can do that via MDIC or various LinkedIn profiles of the presenters today. But we do want to hear from you if you've got ideas or thoughts, so we can do this as an industry rather than as an individual group.
Yeah, I would just like to echo that we speak based on our own experiences. So the more perspectives we can get, the better, just like with patient input.
Terrific. One last thing I do want to mention, we will be making the slides and the recording of this webinar available. So everyone that has registered should receive an email with a link to that, and that should be coming in the next week or so. But with that, I'd like to thank Matt and Mike for joining us, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this MDICx webinar. We look forward to continuing to engage with all of you as we continue to advance the science of patient input. Thank you, everyone.